Welcome back, folks. Another edition of Midweek with Eric Smith, and my guest tonight will be Brad Fay. I just sent the invite to Brad, and he'll be joining into the mix in mere moments. Thanks to everybody who has joined in to watch the show, and there he is. We'll just wait for you to flip it the other way if you can, Brad. You're sideways. There we go. There we go.
Now you're challenging me to stand it up.
Yeah.
Right back.
Sorry. We'll wait for Brad to get a book or something to prop this thing up with.
Crib board is the final piece.
There we go. There we go.
All right. Okay.
Good to see you. Good to see the ceiling.
Yeah. Now we're really screwed because my earphones go in the.
Uh-oh.
So let me try without, and you tell me what the audio.
Like if I
okay.
I can stand it up, is that going to be okay?
That sounds fine to me.
Okay.
Yep.
I know this thing, so what do I know?
All right.
All righty.
No, as long as I'm not going to keep up your family here, because I know it's later at night. So
good. Yeah.
All right. So let me start it back from the beginning then, Brad, because we'll get to some of the current day stuff, and I definitely want to ask you over the course of the next hour or so about the music and the passion, where that came from. But take me back to British Columbia, to the West Coast, and young Brad Fay, when that itch came for you to kind of ultimately do what you're doing right now, or is this an itch that you ultimately did have? I mean, where were you as a youngster in terms of what you kind of wanted to see in adulthood unfolding for you?
Yeah, well, a lot of it was, my interest in sports was right off the bat. And as everybody says, playing everything and knowing that that's going to reach a certain level. I was a goalie playing hockey. You get to a certain age, you're not going to, you're going to play professionally when you're afraid of the puck at 12 years old, that thing. Found basketball instead, which was great. And, but I always was interested in, I read, in lieu of doing my homework, I read Sports Illustrated cover to cover. When everybody says, and you're probably in the same thing when you speak at schools and things like that, you're like, read everything you can. It doesn't have to be sports. And I wasn't a novel reader, which I am now, and I dive into history. That's what I wish I would say. If I win the lottery, I'd buy my way into Harvard to hear somebody speak history and read all about it, the stuff that I'm so interested in, sports, music, everything. But that was my modus operandi. I'm almost having the magazines inside the textbooks, and cheating, reading that way. But it was a job that was, let's face it, John Shannon always uses the term where the candy store, we get to play in a toy store, whatever it is what people want to do. So you kind of think it's an unrealistic goal. I never thought about it that heavily. And then it was really a chance meeting. Came home from college in Calgary one summer. We played pickup basketball with a group, literally a fluky find. We walked in and it was a bunch of guys that were either on TV or in the media in Vancouver. And that was it. Started to get to know them. And the one guy, John McKeechee, who was so instrumental for me, he said, you should be doing what I'm doing. And it wasn't for many years later that I did that because I started a newspaper. But that was kind of the impetus of it. Went back to school, took some broadcasting journalism stuff, and then like it was in the old days, made my way through Campbell River, BC, then to Kelowna. And I was a writer, and I was a decent writer for that level. But I knew reading the guys we work with now, like Grange and Bruce Arthur and Dave Feschek and these great writers, I knew I was not going to get to that level. So it was like, okay, at least I can try to be funny and I can speak. I always would MC friends' weddings and things like that, and it was like, yeah, you can think on your feet. So that was when the move to TV happened, and I got lucky with BC TV, and then Sportsnet started up right after that. So there was a second sports network. They wanted people that weren't affiliated with TSN and that maybe new faces, and that's how it all came about. So with about a year and a half experience, I moved to Toronto and been there at Sportsnet for 21 and a half years.
All right, so let me go back a little bit, Brad, and I'll kind of maybe dig through those layers you just gave us, the various steps along the way here. But even going back to maybe not elementary school, but even into high school, what brought you to basketball? I mean, aside from just being, okay, you got some height to you, and as you said, okay, maybe hockey, being a goalie wasn't working out, but and I say this respectfully, you're growing up obviously now in the early 70s, mid 70s, late 70s, you're a teenager. Basketball in Canada, I mean, there are fans and there are players. And we had Leo Routens on last week, and you would know the history of the Canadian program even, better than I. But it was kind of tough sledding for a while if you were a Canadian baller, let alone a Canadian basketball fan, without a team in your country until the mid 90s, and not necessarily seeing a lot of live games, not necessarily having the spotlight that obviously this generation has on the game. So how was it for a young basketball player out west, no less as well, trying to grow in the game and be passionate as a fan, let alone as a player?
Yeah, well, the real passion for me started, and it's such a different time now. I don't know how many schools have this, but my high school, when I was we had 8 to 12 was high school, elementary school straight to high school. And the team that we had, our senior basketball team when I was in grade 8 and then grade 9, and my brother played, so it took it to another level, was one of those scenes like almost like Hoosiers. The gym was packed. They were, first year they were city champions. The next year they were right there, and it was like every Friday night you'd go, and that was a dream where I'm like, wow, when I played hockey, nobody watched me play. The parents, it's just like packed gym. It was almost like starstruck. So I got into the sport, but as you said, it really wasn't. Guys would be really good basketball players, and they would play a couple of years of both, and then they got to be in about grade 9 or 10, and they had to play hockey if they had a chance to do anything with it, because you had no chance to do anything with it, basketball. So you were, definitely were the outlier, which I actually jumped forward just for a second, worked in my favor, because when I started BCTV, the Grizzlies had just started, and nobody, the old timers, wanted anything to do with basketball. They didn't care. It was all hockey and CFL. So they said, you go ahead and you do it. So it get led to sitting, the front row, the stuff that we take for granted now, but sitting in the media row when Jordan came to town and all that kind of stuff. It was like, wow, okay, I'll do this. But it was, it never was anything that I knew. I remember somebody asked me when the 6'5" and under league came out, and I'm 6'2", and one of my buddies, because I played at college, like, is it, you gonna try out for that? I'm like, you realize how good these guys are? Like, it would be not, there would be no use of that. So I knew there wasn't going to be anything in the future of it, but I loved it, loved the game. And then ultimately it got me out to school in Calgary, which all led to things. But who knew that the pattern would be that it would one day be, hosting NBA games, let alone an finals like we did last year.
How good were you early on or not? I mean, in terms of trying to find your way within the game to ultimately, as you say, to a point where, you could play it at a legit level, and it opened so many doors for you. Yeah,
I was a late bloomer, and I had enough height as a guard. I'm 6'2" now, and I was always, it's funny because our boys are 12 and 10, and we were measuring them. And my oldest is 5'6" now, and he wanted to know how tall I was at his age. And so he's a little taller than I was. So I was, but I was painfully skinny. And I still have no toughness. It was like, that was a thing that was missing. But each year I got better. And the unfortunate thing for me was my brother was a starter, but the 5th starter, sort of an average to better than average player on a really good team. And then by the time I was in grade 12, I was one of the better players, but we had a horrible team. And so I was like, I would have traded that. I even knew that I wanted that. The gyms weren't packed like they were. We weren't playing playoff games. And I took 2 years off before. I didn't even really know what the scene was. And, there was no recruiting back then. I don't think I would have been anyway. And then I went, I played 1 year in Vancouver. And my buddy said, oh, you're going to Capilano College. You have a basketball team. You should try out. So I was unknown, and I didn't play at all that first year, but they were ranked 2 or 3 in the country all year at the college level. So for people watching Ontario, it's like Centennial or Sheridan.
Right.
And it was fantastic, and playing with good players. You're covering some of the best. The guy that was opposite me might have been the best shooter in the country, and I had chased him around. So all of a sudden it got the bug for me. So by the time I went away to Calgary, I was 20 years old and had filled out finally a little bit. And then just, anyone that played any sport, if you're 2 years older than somebody at that age, there's a real difference to your it just sort of took off for me and slowly built Calgary each of those 3 years by the end. And then I was a decent enough player on a really good team. And then that was going to be the end of the line. There was no never a hint of any kind of national team stuff like that, or, you know, no dreams of that. It didn't bother me. I enjoyed it.
You know, it's interesting in listening to, you know, the synopsis too, when you talk about college versus university. I still believe this to this day, Brad, and you know, you can agree to disagree or not. It bothered me for so many years when, and I didn't play at Humber. I just, you know, went to Humber and covered the men's team for the school newspaper for a couple of years. But
good.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. And I mean, this was, you know, 95, 96. And I mean, they were good for many years before that as well. And, you know, we always joked about the banners hanging from the rafters at Humber. You know, it was endless. You know, Mike Cates, the head coach at Humber, was the Canadian Coach K.
Yeah.
Back then I felt, and I still to some extent feel to this day, you put up the best college programs against the university programs, it's going to be a tight battle. And I remember for years thinking, why are the colleges and the universities not playing one another, or why isn't there at least a tournament in which they play against one another? Because a lot of the times, you know, and it might not be the case in today's generation, but certainly going back, you know, 15, 20 years ago and more, there was a case to be made for many of the better athletes were at the collegiate level. No disrespect to the university athletes. There were a lot of great athletes playing college ball, and a lot of it might have just been dollars and cents as well. Some people that maybe couldn't afford university, but they're going to, you know, community college, local college, whatever.
Yeah.
But yet they still are playing sport, and yet there's no competition between the two. It always kind of bothered me.
I think grades was a big thing as well. There were a lot of kids who didn't have the grades to get into university. Maybe didn't want to make that move. Exhibit A is Corey Joseph's dad, David Joseph, who played, interesting enough. So when I was in Mount Royal, the two teams in the conference, is a 10-team conference then. The years that I was there and the previous years, it was the two Calgary teams that were the best. And SAIT was the best. The last year that I was there, they lost. And then we choked in the final because we didn't get to play them. We probably had a chance to knock them off, but getting to the point of they were 7-time conference champions. They won the nationals 2 or 3 times. And David Joseph, just before I got there, was the star. And a perfect example of a guy that was about 6'2" or 6'3", left-handed, jump out of the gym, incredible athlete, and probably one of the best players in Canada at any level at that point. But for whatever reason, didn't have the interest of playing at the university level. He played at both Mount Royal and State in different years, but everybody you talk to talks about how good this guy was. And yeah, it was, again, a different scene back then. There was a little more freedom, I think, for the really good players in colleges. At that State team that I played against, 2 guys went away to university and came back within a month because, and you know, there's probably a few more reasons, but they weren't getting the love. Suddenly it wasn't their show. So I think the guys that are that good at the college level, it's a little bit of a different game, more athletic, a little smaller. The bigs, we played University of Calgary every year. And if I had any designs on playing university, I knew right away, just coming off screens, just getting hammered by guys that were, I'm 6'2", 180, 170 then, and these guys are 6'4", 200, and just, it was a different game physically. But athletically, eventually they wore us down, but they weren't that much better, you know, skill-wise. High-end, a couple guys, but across the board, we would have held our own, probably lost by 15 or something like that. So it wasn't like that, but I know what you're saying. Humber, though, yeah, like they had a program where they would have competed in any of the university conferences in their heyday when under Cates.
Well, I remember Bernie Austin, the old security guy for the Toronto Raptors, and he was very active in the kind of collegiate and certainly high school scene in Toronto, in the GTA. And he always used to say, give me the 12 best players from Toronto or from Southern Ontario at most. And I don't care if it's college or university, you can have the rest of the country from east to west. I'll take care of it with just my GTA guys and my Southern Ontario guys. But then, you know, that maybe speaks to the programs, obviously, that were certainly in Toronto with Humber, and you mentioned, you know, whether it be Sheridan, Centennial, Seneca, a lot of the good programs around here. How did you find the balance as a collegiate athlete and then also focusing on your studies?
Yeah, I wasn't very good with the latter. So, you know, I just sort of bounced around different things, whatever it took. A lot of us talk about, you know, to keep our scholarship. We had a small scholarship and to keep our eligibility to play. When I focused, I stayed the one more year. And I think as most people do when they go to college and they're not sure what they want to do, and your buddies are there and you know, the guys that you play with and the guys that you hang out with, and you feel like life well, if I lived here, this would be my life every night till, you know, I'm 35. You're like, what's the movie? You're the movie guy, the guy who drives a golf cart around. Ryan Reynolds, Van Wilder.
Yes, Van Wilder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I stayed one more year because I didn't want to leave. I wasn't going to play anymore. My eligibility was done. But I took a broadcasting course, and that was suddenly where the eureka. It was one of the instructors right away took a liking to me and said, you can do this. And I realized for the first time, you know, academically, one, that I was trying, but two, it was, I looked around and I thought, you know, you do your own little, you do it in sports too, where you look around when you're thinking, who's going to make it? Or are there 12 guys better than me? Or are there 5 guys better than me to start? So same thing in this class, the first couple of weeks, I thought, if this is what the people are coming out, I'm better than these people. How
right.
I don't know. But then that year, my studies took off in that course, and I was up the top of everything because I ate it all up. But I wasn't. I did not have a very good balance when I was playing in college, and I was lazy with that. I put all the work into being on the court, and I was what was considered a smart player on the court. I made up for lack of some athletic prowess by being a smart guy, but it didn't translate to the classroom. I'm never gonna lie about that. So
it's interesting, and I don't know if your boys will go back and watch this tomorrow or not, or if they might be watching even part of it right now, who knows. But what I find as a father as well, and again, you can agree or disagree, I wasn't a great high school student. I wasn't terrible, but I mean, I was an average student. You know, probably if I got a 70, I was happy. If I got an 80, I was thrilled, and I wasn't even seeing 90s. Yeah. But when you do something that you actually enjoy, or that you actually are starting to see sort of the fruits of your labor, or you know, some sort of passion, some sort of interest is sprung inside you, what a difference it makes in terms of just the focus that it brings to you. And my point being, it wasn't really until college that I kind of locked in and said, yeah, what I thought I wanted to do is what I wanted to do, and I'm actually enjoying this. I'm enjoying the journalism program. And to your point, you know, trying to find that thing, and then when it finally hit, it's when the light clicks and it goes. But yet, as fathers, and I'm sure it's what our parents went through as well, yeah, you're trying to focus on your studies, get your work done, and it's trying to find that balance between, all right, get your work done, be serious, be focused, and you gotta do it. It's part of life. But at the same time, don't necessarily fret the A versus the B minus versus the C plus, because hey, everybody, whether they're 10, whether they're 15, whatever age they're trying to find their path and trying to find their passion.
It doesn't matter ultimately, or not ultimately, always, I should say. I remember my dad talking, he's retired, long retired now, but he was a stockbroker. And then when he was at the point of hiring people, he'd get these students that would come out of UBC, straight A's, 98%. And they knew everything about the business and their math, all that stuff, but they did not have, the sort of the people skills, and they had no interest in sports or music or culture or, whatever it was. And when you're talking, so him being in the stock market, it's like, well, you can't necessarily go out and sell stocks to people or talk to people about things and that kind of stuff. So it's the same thing. My mom laughs now. She goes, well, I'm glad it all worked out. But she always says, I hope you have a son just like you, so you know what I went through. And everything for her was based on grades, and my grades were not what they should be. And I established a level in elementary school where I was smart in all those aptitude tests.
Right.
Came to doing the work, I just couldn't. It just didn't excite me. But then eventually you get to the point where whether somebody else does or you kick yourself in the butt. But what you said is very true. You find something that you're confident with, and then suddenly you realize, okay, I could take this forward, and and then if it's something that you enjoy, then it's even better. But it's such a fine line. You need that break, and you need that opportunity, and then you do what you do with it. We've seen so many people in this business get the opportunity that doesn't work out, and then you might not get that next one because it's such a small field.
So let me go back to maybe 10 minutes ago when you talked about initially back now?
Yeah, there you are. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yeah, I don't know. I might have to yell upstairs to my wife if she's on the TV or something. Maybe she's screwing up our feed or something.
Unbelievable the difference of the internet these days.
Like, yes, big time.
You try to log into something, it's like, can everybody shut the games down for 1 second? I need to get, yeah. There you go.
Well, I'm even hardwired right now into my phone, like old school with the Ethernet cable, and it's still kind of garbling up from time to time. So, what I was saying was, at what point then, as you said about 10 minutes ago, that you kind of veered off the path of writing, thinking you were maybe going to be a writer, and then to go into broadcasting. How difficult was that decision? Because here we are, we just talked about kind of finding a path, finding a dream, realizing that you're on this path towards something you might want, and then on that path having to say, well, hold on a second, I'm not going to be a writer. I might not be good enough to be a writer, and kind of going in a different direction. Yeah.
So I was in what you would call so I was Kelowna would be the equivalent of working perhaps in Kitchener or trying to give examples of places across the country, sort of mid-market they might call it. And I had reached the crux of that, and I hadn't even looked at getting into big markets in terms of a writer. But the writing ultimately helped, because the first time I went down and did an audition, when you write a story, for example, the lead and the supporting paragraph, or the first 200 words are what set the tone, and the good writers just keep it going all the way through. It's every
right.
Something clever. I could do that first part. It's a matter of supporting it on a consistent basis, and we wrote so much too. I had to write 4 or 5 stories a day at the smaller newspaper. So when I went down to audition, just on a whim, he said, come in. I didn't leave my job or anything. I just went down when I was home visiting my family in the summer. And they said, oh, your writing is quite something. Because I thought, well, all I have to do is write most people would say, and I remember that back then, it would be like, well, the Canucks and the Bruins hook up tonight. The Bruins have lost 3 straight. The Canucks have won 3 straight. Something has to give. Here's the highlights. It's kind of like, well, I could have read that in the paper. So I just different, level, not anything spectacular, but told a story leading to the highlights. And that was the first thing. That's when this piqued their interest. They said, well, you're obviously you can write. And I sort of changed their thinking that way. And then it was interesting for me, because I didn't have to make the cold turkey situation decision. I was in touch with the managing editor of the TV station. He said, I can give you some fill-in stuff if you take holidays. And it happened one whole cycle of a year where when they needed me, I didn't have any vacation left, or the boss in Kelowna, who was very cooperative, wouldn't let me go. So finally, they called on, I think it was about mid-December one day, and they said, the union guy said, we have layoffs coming. You're protected, but we need to, by law, offer anybody, senior people, I'd been there 5 years, you can take a buyout and save a job. The light went off in my head. I thought, okay, 6 months pay, then I can be available, because Kelowna is 4 hours from Vancouver. And that was that was the way I did. I took the buyout. I got the check, and then immediately phoned the guy at the station, said, I'm available anytime. And he had me come down about 3 months later. And then it worked out that they made a big shift. They went from an older crew to a quote unquote younger group. And yeah, again, it was nerve wracking. I still haven't watched that first time I was on. I tried to once. I can't do it. It wasn't awful. I didn't crash and burn. It wasn't Albert Brooks sweating like I almost did on one of our Sportsnet Central at home. But or a Basketball Central at home, but it just was so stiff. And then once you kind of the light clicks, where you realize, you're just talking. That's what I tell everybody. You know what you're talking about. Yeah. If we had to go on and do news, for example, and be, like, I'd be fine if there's a teleprompter and I'm talking about what's going on in the Middle East and what's going on with the economy, and all of a sudden the prompter drops. They'd be like deer in the headlights. What do you know? It's always saying, sports. If something goes wrong, it's like, no, you're talking about the Raptors, or you're talking about the Canucks back then, whatever it is. And it didn't take long to get so many miles, because I did 2 or 3 sportscasts a day the way they did it there. They had a noon show at 6 o'clock. So by, each week you got that much better, and then it felt comfortable and realized. And then it different levels from that point forward. But once you get comfortable, as you talked about, with what you want to do, then it takes over a little bit.
How much did your radio experience help you as well, when you talk about the television growth, let alone the television experience, and kind of putting you where you are now? Because that's the one thing I know selfishly for me, Brad, is that, I came to TV, well into my radio career, but the point that you just made, I don't know that I've ever worked with a teleprompter because I essentially haven't needed to. Even the brief time when I did Blue Jays Express that one summer when we thought the Jays were going to be World Series champions or at least contenders, and they flamed out. I didn't want the prompter. What's that?
Everything Blue Jays when they
yes yeah. Like I couldn't deal with the prompter. I would rather just kind of ad lib or look down at my script once I knew I was off camera. But I found it was far easier to just talk to the camera. I had somebody ask me today about, somebody wrote and asked, your advice for a young and aspiring journalist. And I say the same thing all the time. Not saying this is the golden rule, but this is my golden rule. I've never written a question down in 20 plus years because I go into an interview knowing what my first question is.
Yeah.
And then from there, everything else is up in my head. I have 10 questions ready or however many it takes, but if I'm too busy looking down at my sheet, worrying about the next question, I might miss what the guy says, what the woman says, whomever I'm interviewing, and the answer might take me in a completely different direction, might take the interview in a different direction. And I think a lot of that sort of ad-libbing and freelancing, the improv certainly came from hosting radio shows and doing live radio broadcasts where there is no script and there is no prompter.
You have to fill it. Yeah, you have to fill the whole time, right? You can't throw it back to somebody else. And it's funny what you said about the interview because I've given that same advice because it's the old thing where you ask a question, a softball early, something like, so what's it like to be back? Say if the Raptors come back, it's like, what's it like to be back? And the guy halfway through his first answer drops a complete bomb.
Yeah.
Oh, da-da-da-da, this is what I was doing. I was out every night when I was supposed to be home and da-da-da. And then you're like, you just don't listen and go to the next question. Or you ask the question that he just answered because he gave you an answer and people don't listen. So I agree with you with that. It's got to be conversational. But okay, let's go back to the original question now. I've forgotten radio. The radio experience for me in Kelowna began, Rick Ball calls games for the Calgary Flames and does some national stuff for us on the hockey side. He was the play-by-play voice of the Kelowna Rockets Western Hockey League team, and I was the beat writer. So I said, he said, you're plugging again. He said, why don't you just do color while you're on the road? So that was a really interesting experience on a number of levels because I always had to leave with about 3 minutes left in the game and to start writing my story to get it in on deadline. Out saying exactly what just happened. You have to come up with the way. So that taught me to be creative and lead. And then you learn to know when he's going to stop talking and when to jump in. And so that was fantastic experience for me. And then when Sportsnet, different level, when I did a little bit of Bob McCowan's show. And I remember I said to, I think it was when Walker was still there. He's in Vancouver now, but he and JD were doing the show. And the first time I ever hosted. And I just came out. I said, I never did not have respect for people that host radio, but I said, wow, it's a lot different, especially with the call in. Because I said to someone, I said, people call in about Blue Jays. And I said, listen, I don't follow baseball. I don't necessarily like it. It's the only sport I never do other than 2 times a year. So I said, if you want to ask me a question, I'm not going to give you an opinion. You tell me and I'll listen kind of thing.
Right.
But I said, if I had that job, McCowan's job, I never had any designs on it, but meaning if I had that job, I would know baseball. You have to. And so there's a different, element of that. But again, that talk, the radio, you've done it where there's no guests, they say, we're joined by whoever, and then all of a sudden they're not there. And you got 5 minutes. You can't just stop talking and you can't go to a break. So it all adds up. I think I said that I'd done radio, newspaper, and TV very early in my career. I'd done all 3, and I was one of the first only because I wouldn't have been an expert. I wouldn't have been the guy like the Doug Smiths of the world that they bring in because they're and Michael Grange, they're columnists, and we bring them on. It just happened that way, and I thought one day they'll all come together. I don't know if I believed it, but it certainly did, and they all add different elements to everything. And I think it's been fun, and you've probably seen it too, that all these guys, they all have an appreciation for what everybody's job is, right? Like the writer guys get on TV and realize it's not that easy just to talk and be quick and look at the camera and be presentable. And just like us on TV to try to write and really vet out a story, I'm just blown away sometimes what those guys write. So same thing.
Well, it's funny. We got into that last night. I had Shai Davidi on, and we got onto that very topic. And I said, you know, not to downgrade what you do certainly, or even me to a lesser extent in the TV side, but we have, you know, I use the example with Shai, end of the game. End of the game. Now, granted, we might be up in 3 minutes live, and we need to do 90 seconds live. And again, maybe for you and I and many others, it's sort of just that the adrenaline of being live. It's almost easier sometimes. It's almost better because even if you screw up a couple of words, you just keep going, as opposed to, well, I know I can redo this again, or I know I can, you know, I just, not to say what we do doesn't come with its challenges. I can't imagine, though, and I said this to Shai, trying to write on deadline, knowing that my article, my column is due in 30 minutes, and maybe there was a quick change in the game in the last 5 minutes that completely blew up what I was trying to write or what I formulated in my head, and then trying to plug in quotes that are coming after the fact, sending it to an editor who's going to send it back, hopefully without chopping it up, and knowing that I might have to do a quick rewrite. I don't know how those guys do that, and make it make sense and make it sound good on the page in such a short amount of time.
I think that Grange just posted something along those lines where he was nominated for his game, either game 5 or game 6. I think it was game 5, Golden State story. And that was the game where Kyle had the shot in the corner, of course.
Yeah.
And like, you're writing that, you know, this is either history that the Raptors win at home and win their first championship, or we're going back to Oakland. And I just, again, can't imagine. We react to that on the floor. In your case, it was the Kawhi shot, right? Like, it's basically, he makes it, they win, it's a happy interview, and you go where you go. Whereas if he misses, they lose in overtime, then you got to readjust, and you're like, you know, you're talking about a bigger story even, because the team, again, failed to get past that. So, yeah, as you say, with the writers and that going deeper. And I should mention, when you mentioned the prompter, I wanted to comment on that, because I haven't used one probably for 10 years since I went to live TV. And it's difficult, but the odd time you go back in the studio and they go, you want the teleprompter, and they put it up, and I go, no, like you just said, put it away. But way I practice with, if anybody's out, feel like Don Cherry, you kids out there. But what it was a weird thing to get used to. And what the only way you could practice is I put up on my home computer before I was going down to do my audition. And I put it, you know, found the print that was the right size, and I just used the cursor and at it. I wrote scripts and read them. And the first one, you get completely lost.
Yep.
One, you slow down and you have to wait. And then you also write at your speed. And then you hope that the person that is flipping the thing, you're not waiting for the next, you know. But it's a very, very unique thing, because if you're relying on it and it goes down, and or you look down at your script and then you look back up and it's moved on, or if somebody Ron Burgundy's you know, then you're really it's an interesting, you know, and ad-libbing just becomes natural, and you can't plan for it. Like you said, you have a game plan in terms of general way you're going to go, but you need to be prepared for anything at that point. And I think we got, you know, last spring, we got that on a nightly basis. Try to tell people, like, it wasn't that they won the championship that was so exciting. It was that every night and every series, even Orlando, they lose game 1, there were stories there.
Yeah.
They got through that. From that point forward, they were counted out 2 or 3 times in each series. And it was so compelling. So you can't prepare for that. It's not like, oh, like, they're going to win, you know, the Golden State the previous 2 years. What am I going to write when they win by 40 again? It never was like that. So it was a great challenge on every level.
All right, before I go back in time again, just seeing as you brought it up in the midst of this conversation about prompters, even when you're doing the Olympics, no prompter? No. That's impressive.
Yeah, the only prompter I do in the Olympics is the very last. We'll do a throw to the kind of the wrap. And I like to sort of, instead of just saying, well, it was great Olympics, Canada won this, I like to have a little bit of a narrative, a Bob Costas type of feel. And so I will script that. And they, if it works, they'll let me use that. But otherwise, again, it's really tough to script something because you don't know what's going to happen. And I always use the example of the 2016 Olympics, the Summer Olympics in Rio. I had, my notes were about this thick, and I probably used about that much of it. And in the course of those notes, I had one line on Penny Alexiak. 6-year-old coming out party, went to my kid's school, went to my kid's home. I figured I'd mention that at some point. And that was it. And then she explodes in those first 2 or 3 nights of the games. And all we talked about was her. So you're reacting all the time. And that's the one fix it's all about. If you're just joining us, that's the one time you can use that cliche, because literally things are happening all the time. Canada's won another couple of medals. We'll take you out eventually to this, but here's this. So there's an opportunity to script certain features, but once you get in the rhythm of just kind of talking off the cuff, I think people appreciate, they could probably tell the difference right away if you're not.
So let's go back now, Brad. As you noted earlier, very early in your career, the opportunity to pick up shop, move from West, come East, come to Ontario. How did that all come together with Sportsnet starting, and you know, how were you found, who contacted you, and what ultimately drove you to say, yes, that's what I'm doing, and taking the leap and coming to join a brand new sports network?
Yeah, so there was a station called VTV, which was initially the CTV affiliate, and it was on its own. And then they eventually joined. You're laughing at what Ryan?
I am, sorry. I try not to look down at the comments very often, but I saw Ryan Leslie earlier was saying something about you and me and Bromby and whatever. Yeah. But I just saw the booze, and I think maybe the comment was you just having some booze, but the way I read it right as you said, what led to the move? Booze.
Yeah. Booze. Booze here's the history of booze. It was Darren Dreger doing a feature on an NHL player that had gotten in trouble, and with Dreger when he was at Sportsnet, and just the way he says booze was the root of all evil. So all of us, if you talk to Balmer and you talk to many people that say it. Anyway, so I was at BCTV, and I got a call one night from Perry Solkowski. Some people may know that name out there, and he's still on Vancouver radio. I'm gonna have to let the dog out here. Hang on here.
I love it.
They're all up asleep, and Harley's got to go out, so got to do it.
This is great. This is live Instagram. I love it.
There's no prompter for the dog. So anyway, and I knew who Perry was because I had watched him when he was in Edmonton, and he was at VTV at that point. And he just said, we're looking to expand, and we think we're going to get the Sportsnet contract, because if Sportsnet was CTV Sportsnet originally, if people remember.
Yep.
Had affiliates all over the place. So I thought, well, it's an interesting opportunity. So I met with the guy, and it didn't work out. He was kind of weird. He kept saying, you gotta make a decision, gotta make a decision now. And I was comfortable at BCTV. So 4 months later, Sportsnet gets VTV as their affiliate. So the same guy calls me, and on the Friday says, you need to make a quick decision. We got to move on this. And I thought, I'm new at this, but this is the same guy that said this to me 3 months ago, and they hadn't made a move. So I thought, okay. So I ended up, for the only time in my career, I got an agent, and I just said, I don't want to deal with this. You deal with it. So I ended up going to them, going to BTV, and that was when I was supposed to do the Grizzlies sidelines, and that was when the NBA had its lockout. Mm-hmm. 98, 99 or 97, 98, whatever it was. They had the half season. So I moved out here February 99. So it would have been the 98, 99. And I literally, the day the NBA started up again, I got hired to move out to Toronto. And the funny thing with that story is that Scott Moore came to Vancouver, and he said, I'm going to be in the studios tomorrow. And Scott Moore was running Sportsnet then for the first time. He came back later. And he said, I want to talk to you. So immediately, what do we all do, right? It's like, oh, this is it. He's unhappy. I don't know, and so I knew that they weren't getting, I was supposed to be the reporter, like the, remember Kent Chillibeck at TSN and all the guys that are Dan Murphy doing it now, like the Ryan Leslie, Booth, those guys doing the reports. And I couldn't, because they had so many shows on the local TV that I was hosting a lot of the sportscast, which was great experience for me. So it all worked out, but I thought they're not getting as much from me as they expected. And there's no NBA. I'm not covering they're doing the sideline. So anyway, long story short, I walk in, guns a-blazing. Scott says, how are you doing? First thing out of my mouth is, well, I'm not really doing what I want to do. I kind of feel like da-da-da-da, and I'm protecting myself. And he goes, anyway, we're making a change on the desk. Would you be interested in moving out to Toronto? So, you know, so he's offering me a promotion. I thought he was going to warn me that he's going to fire me. So
Yeah.
That was, he said, put a tape together and then, you know, da-da-da. So I did that. And then it was a couple of weeks later, he phoned, he made an offer. And so I moved out on a whim, and I arrived in Toronto the week that Mel Lastman had called the army in because the snowstorm.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
the woman who was working for Scott Moore at that point, who organized everything for me, they got me a place to live for a month, and they organized moving my car out and all these things. And she said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" So I basically, moved out. It was Super Bowl weekend because I came out to work with Jamie Campbell on the weekends, and he was covering the Super Bowl. So I did a shift throwing to him at the Super Bowl, and then we came back and met. It was all really, really convoluted, but everybody was new at that point. Nobody was really known on the national scene. Later, Mike Toth came back from Calgary because he had been at TSN and was calling games in Sportsnet for a year in Calgary. But otherwise, we were all kind of unknown. And so there was a blank canvas, and it was, it was pretty wild. But it was, it basically felt like, I'm going to leave where I've always lived out west, and I hate the Leafs, and I'm not a baseball fan. I like the Grizzlies still. It's like,
Yeah.
fandom's going to be different. It all changed, of course, after that. Not the Leafs part, but everything else. And I've never looked back. And now with my wife and family here, it's not not a stretch to say it's home for sure.
What was it like in the initial stages, as you said, with the blank canvas? Because I know I tell the story on the radio side, and I'm dating myself a little bit with this reference, but anybody that's watching, of course, remembers WKRP. That's what the Fan used to be like. It was a tiny little studio on 40 Holly Street at Yonge and Eglinton, and things were certainly a lot different when the Fan got purchased by Rogers, and then you joined the Rogers campus. But of course, long before Rogers and One Mount Pleasant and everything else, it was out in Scarborough, out in a smaller building. It's the original guys, as you said, yourself and Jamie and Darren Millard and Mike Toth and Drager and just this young upstart sort of sports network that's trying to take on the big older brother that's been there for years in TSN. I mean, that must have been just kind of cool to be a part of something from the beginning and try to help grow it, and then to see where it is now today.
I'll tell you what, the blessing, to be sure, was there was no Twitter and no social media. And I know that, and I don't blame them. And I heard stories of TSN guys, oh, we watched one night and we turned it off, and we knew you weren't a threat and whatever. And we probably weren't. We had the NHL national rights at that point, which was a big key because we were able to, at least one night a week get the national audience. But I think we were a little bit more, I don't know, like we just weren't so serious, and TSN never really had to be anything different because they were the only ones on there. And I always say, when I say this, not name dropping like he's a best friend, we hang out, but James Duthie is a friend of mine. I know him well. And I always feel like we made him, us being at Sportsnet, made James Duthie, because if we had any personality, any characters like Toth, for instance, all of a sudden they went from being very, very straight across the board back then to they bring this guy in who in my mind is, is one of the very best in our business and clever. And his position, I think, was probably strengthened. He would have made it anyway, but he became this star because it's like, okay, well, maybe they've got something over there. We need to, to bring somebody in
Sure.
who got more than just the straight big voice and here's the highlights and everything else. And obviously he's never looked back, but I don't know if any of us ever have made it a competition. You know that when you're at the arena, when you see people, it's not like there's a look away and it's like there's the enemy. We're all kind of in it together. It's like I noticed that the opposite right away, being out at a bar or a restaurant or something when I first moved here, and then all of a sudden I look over there and there's whoever, Brendan Connor from TSN, and he's like, oh, hey Brad. It's like I expected him to be like, oh, the competition. Like,
Yeah.
Nobody cares. There's only so many jobs, and it's so I'm sure there were times, and I think it was more at the higher end, the higher business guys, that a lot of them had connections. Scott Moore and Keith Pelly and all those guys, they worked at both of them. So I think they wanted to beat each other, and that's great. Good for us because they put resources in, but I don't think it ever felt that way. We knew we were second for a long time, and we had our run with the perfect timing of getting the NHL deal back and the Blue Jays doing what they did, and where we got back on top. Now it seems to be, it doesn't really, you know, there's nothing really to choose from. And I think it's more like, I don't know, that's what feeling I get. It's more like a big fraternity or sorority than it is a competition now.
Yeah, I mean, and so many guys have now worked on both sides, and then, you know, you reference in the Olympics again. You think about when the two sides came together. I know that was strange even for me as a guy from, you know, I'm essentially a Rogers lifer. When, you know, you kind of take the telemedia years at the Fan, but then get swallowed up by Rogers. I've, you know, been at the Fan / Sportsnet my entire career, yeah. And then here I am in the TSN studios calling men's boxing in 2012 for the Canadian, you know, Olympic Consortium, but I'm in TSN and had a TSN swipe card, and I'm walking through the halls thinking, like, I don't know, am I privy to any secrets around here? You know, I'm just kind of welcomed into the enemy for a couple of weeks, and then, all right, turn your card back in. But I am walking around with the Bell logo and walking through the TSN radio hallways and seeing a bunch of guys that I used to work with on the radio and TV side. And it's just, you know, it's hey, at the end of the day too, we're all still partners now on the ownership side with sports. That there is sort of that sort of crossover, and it's just, you know, it's healthy competition, but it's not war per se.
No, the Olympics changed that for sure. And I remember that moment in Sochi, 2016, that Kate Burness was hosting the hockey coverage for the whole thing. So and we came on, you know, you got on, people don't know TV sometimes, where you know you're going to be thrown to each other. They get you up a couple minutes beforehand to establish, you know, like we did tonight. Can you hear me? Is that a good? Can you see me? Turn your phone around, as you told me, right? And so I remember we got on, and there's Kate, and she says, "Wow, this is really interesting, isn't it?" And Kate had, where she had worked at Sportsnet, not on camera, and then ends up having a great career being an on-air person. And but it was just so awkward, not awkward, but it was just awesome, maybe a better word, but in the sense that people might think it's awkward. It's Brad Fay of Sportsnet throwing to, we get more from Kate Burness, you know, and so we had a lot.
It paused again on my end for a second there. I think we got each other back.
Yeah.
So take me through, Brad. You know, I find this really interesting because, and I'm guilty of not even kind of accepting or understanding this or realizing this until even just this conversation. But from the writing to the reporting to the anchoring to the hosting, what do you enjoy most? Or what do you even think you're best at in terms of how your career has morphed in all the different roles, play-by-play, all the different things that you've done over the course of your 20-plus years?
Yeah, very little play-by-play. Two or three NBA games and a couple of college games is not my thing. So I have great respect for guys like you that do that. That's a different skill altogether. I guess if I narrowed it down to what I enjoy the most, it's the big events like the Olympics, like the Rogers Cup. Obviously, you know, the greatest thing I've ever been through, and I know it'd be yours as well, is what happened with the Raptors last spring. Vancouver Olympics, I thought, would be the top thing. And this, you know, there's Ryan again. You know, it's that no booze reference there, but good. He's having fun. The earlier out there, we got to remember it's 2 hours. That whole sort of almost tour guide type of feel, where you're the one that's, you know, taking the Olympics, all the different venues, tennis, all the different matches, and I enjoy that the most. Trying to piece that together and you try to tie in stories from here to there and that kind of thing. But as I said, after that Vancouver Olympics, I said nothing will ever touch it. I've said this lots of times until last year. I said I hope something does, but I don't think anything will. And then that what happened last spring eclipsed it. And I think more than anything is the fact that it was over that 2 months, right? You build up the
Yeah.
story. And then it goes back to the previous 2 or 3 years watching this team get close and then just get annihilated by Cleveland. So we can't even say they were close, but they were expected to be better. And so that, again, on a nightly basis, but the difference is sharing the games with TSN. You're not the tour guide the whole night. But I guess it comes down to hosting a big event is what I enjoy the most. And I like being and not meaning this sounds funny, not meaning that I have to be, but I use this as a term, being the first voice and the last voice that you hear. I grew up, I was drawn to those guys. I was drawn to Howard Cosell and Jim McKay and Bob Costas more than the play-by-play guys. They were background to me. I loved the setup. When Brian Williams would come on like 8 hours before the Grey Cup, I watched every minute of it. He's sitting in the glass encased thing set in the end zone, in the stands. It's 10 in the morning. The game's starting at 6. I would watch the whole thing because I couldn't wait. So it's that fun of getting it set up and those half an hour and then hour shows that we did last year. It's a backstage pass, right? That's what we always say. It's like people can't wait to see the guys arriving, what they're wearing, what they're doing on the floor, who's playing, who's not. And there were a lot of those stories last year in the NBA Finals as well.
What I remember most about last year, and you kind of touched on a little bit earlier too, is when you kind of look round by round, and with due respect to the Magic, kind of putting them aside for a second. Yeah, that first game was tough, but then it was fairly quick with 4 straight. But when you go into round 2 and all the storylines that we saw in Philly, and then of course the shot, go into round 3 and in the conference final, with down 0-2 and then the triple overtime and then ripping off 4 straight. It to me, Brad, was the fans that kind of came in as this was going on, and call it bandwagon or otherwise, it just kept growing and growing and growing. And you got a sense of the audience is growing and getting bigger. And every game that passes, the numbers just keep rising. And I never asked you this in the midst of it, but do you speak to or try to speak to some of the new fans that maybe don't know the storylines a little bit, or do you have to keep it as focused as you can to the passionate folks so that you don't piss them off because they don't want to be talked down to?
Yeah, I think the latter is where you go. And it's like at that stage, you expect that people are sports fans and are hardcore fans. I think that was ESPN's motto all the time with their broadcasters. They say, we're talking to the sports fan. We don't need to say the full names, the Toronto Raptors of the NBA. It's like, you don't need to tell people, where you're coming from. And I mean, it doesn't change how you do a broadcast. Like that's when people say, are you nervous? I heard there were 8 million people watching last night. Well, it's like you're looking into the camera. If there's nobody watching or there's 8 million people, there's really no difference. I find it, if you're speaking in an audience where there's people sitting there, then it becomes a little different. Or suddenly the boss walks in and is standing right off camera watching you. Then you may, you're suddenly kind of like, wait a second. But yeah, like you said, those numbers, I had a conversation with Arash Madani when Game 7 hit like 3.2 million or something, for the total audience. It peaked higher than that for Kawhi's shot. And he said, that's got to be the peak. There's not that many basketball fans, in this country. That'll be the record by that point, it was a record by 1 million. And then it just kept going up 1 million every game, it seemed. So you got to find and realized everybody loves a winner. So there were I never thought of that until you just said it, like speaking to a different audience. You realize, obviously, the hardcores are there. There's 5,000 hardcore Blue Jay fans, 500,000 Raptor fans, and a little more than that with the Leafs. And then the audience grows bigger as the team gets better. But yeah, I wouldn't even think to change it, but you can't. And those people need to catch up. If they're joining the fray, then they need to know what's going on, and they probably do if they're tuning in. But wow, what a buzz walking in there and knowing that, again, as a fan growing up, my favorite thing was being taken somewhere, especially when it was a team that I cared about. So when you realize that you're kind of you're the deliverer of that, it's a big responsibility. But at the same time, you realize, okay, I can't be a fan, I can't be too crazy, but you also can't be mellow. This is Game 7. It's like you need to be the right energy. And that's our challenge in those kind of situations.
All right, we only have about 5 minutes left here, and I don't know if Ryan's still watching or not, but I know he's a close friend of yours, and you guys have been to a lot of shows together and whatnot. I wanted to find out where the Springsteen passion started, how it started, because, and maybe you can fill the audience in on the number of shows you've been to over the years as well, and this absolute passion and fanaticism that you have for Bruce.
Okay, is the audio okay for you? Because you're skipping out of there a little bit.
It's okay on my end, but yeah, I can tell that the picture is a little bit choppy, but the audio sounds fine.
So I always was a music guy. Went to one project I'm taking on here in this situation, obviously where we're at, a little more time, as I'm trying to go through my ticket stubs. I posted some online, but I'm going to sort of write almost like a memoir of all these concerts I went to and the stories around them. It started early in high school. So I was completely committed right away. I found it. I was like, I know I love sports. And it's like, wow, the concert, you always win unless it's a really bad show. You know, you don't, a great sporting event like Game 7 against Philly and that kind of thing. You're not going to trade that for any concerts ever, but there's a lot of bad Wednesday nights in the middle of a season that don't deliver. So once I got the buzz with concerts, the Springsteen one was very interesting because I didn't know much of his music, but I always heard this reputation of this guy puts on the great show. Everybody's heard it, right? It's like, oh, I heard he's great in live. So he came in '84, peak of his powers in terms of commercial success with the Born USA tour. And my buddy and I bought scalp tickets, and it was, I think then we paid $140 for a pair of tickets, and they were $20 each. It was all the money we had. But I just said, we got to go. This is it. He's playing the one show. And I came out of there honestly changed. It was I knew 3 songs going in. I went the next day down to the record store and bought every cassette. That's how it works. And that was it. Was like, I couldn't find anything that made me feel the way I felt when I saw him. And I'm like that with a lot of concerts, but this one was a different level. And then it just became like my season ticket. I always say, you know, my number, which I won't completely reveal, but it's like the equivalent almost of going to 2 full seasons. If you had Raptor tickets or Leaf tickets and you went every game for 2 years, it's a little more than that. How many of those games do you walk out of where you're out of your mind? One of the great things I've ever seen, and you're inspired by it. A great game you are, but a lot of games you're not. And then it came to traveling, with whether it's with work or whether we're going on vacation, kind of look at the schedule. And I've seen them all over the world. And it's just been one of those things that's been a great relationship. And there's guys that have seen him way more than me. And but it's something that I enjoy. If he's anywhere nearby and I have a chance and financially it works, I'm going to go. And that's how that's where it's at. So, yeah, I know you saw him with Jack, right? You finally Jack dragged you down in Buffalo. Yeah.
Well, only the one time with Jack, and I mean, I hope there's a chance to see him at least one more time, if not many more. So, listen, I think our signal's getting choppy again. I don't know if it's my end, your end. I feel like it's mine somehow. So I'll end it here. We're up against it anyways. I think we're done in about a minute. Instagram kicks you off after the 1 hour. So I appreciate this, Brad. Thanks for doing it, and I'll look forward to chatting with you over our next Zoom chat, I guess, at some point in the next few days. And I think it might have froze again. Listen, if you can hear me, Brad, all the best, man. Thanks for doing this.